Um, Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Norman Howell. I'm the CEO of the Pipeline Industries Guild, and I'm your host for this webinar. I'd like to welcome you all. This is the first of our Guild Goes Green webinar series, which we are hosting during this month. And these are themed on sustainability and environmental topics. And today I'm delighted to welcome Steph Wray and John Davies of RSK Biocensus, who will be providing our first presentation in this series entitled Biodiversity Net Gain for Linear Infrastructure. And this is explaining how we can achieve biodiversity net gain for pipelines and other linear projects. Steph is Managing Director of RSK Biocensus. They're a specialist biodiversity consultancy of the RSK group. She is an ecologist and biodiversity expert with over 25 years experience in assessment of impacts on diversity. And prior to joining Biocensus, Steph has held a number of senior management and consultant positions at Hydro Consulting, Peter Brent, Atkins, National Grid and ERM. And Steph will be taking us on a magical mystery tour of all things BNG, what it means, how we can achieve it when we can't acquire land, and how to get the best bang for your biodiversity buck. And John is a director of RSK Biocensus. He's also the chair of the RSK Wilding Steering Group. He is an ecological consultant with over 24 years experience in the assessment of impacts on biodiversity. And prior to joining Biocensus, John was head of ecology at Acadus UK. And in January this year, he was made a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And John's going to explain to us the wonders of rewilding and how small contributions from our projects will help turn the tide on climate change and biodiversity loss. So as I said just earlier, just to remind you, during the presentation, if you use the chat function for questions, and then I'll host those questions and the answer session at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to now hand over to Steph to start the presentation. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks very much, Norman. Right, I'm just going to turn my video off if I can. There we go. And then we can concentrate on the slides a little bit better and we'll get on with the presentation. So as Norman said, we're both ecologists, and by ecologists, I don't mean a lifestyle choice involving the wearing of socks with sandals and knitting our own yogurt, but we're actually scientists who look at the complexity of the natural world. So what we're trying to do all of the time is to triangulate the vectors of interconnectedness of all things, as Douglas Adams would say. And one of the most complicated things that we can talk about is biodiversity. Within all of the natural environment, it's really tricky because it's very complicated. And what biodiversity net gain is about is around trying to synthesize all of that complexity into something easy that we can apply on our projects. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is, why we're doing it now, how it works, how we're actually calculating it, and then I'll give you some top tips for your projects on what you need to think about in making sure you get this right. And then maybe some spoilers for the future around environmental net gain. And John will take over to talk about rewilding and how we can actually help you to deliver it. So it should be pretty non-technical, but do drop a question in the chat if there's anything that's not clear. And so, first of all, what is biodiversity? Well, this is the official definition. Personally, I don't like it very much. Didn't like it in Rio in 1992, and I haven't become more of a fan since. Because it's not a very inclusive definition. When you see that on the page there, is it? Your average man on the Clapham omnibus doesn't understand it. It's useful if you want to talk to a scientist. But essentially, when we're talking about biodiversity, we mean all of the complexity and diversity of life on Earth. It's just nature. So what has biodiversity ever done for us then, eh? Well, obviously there's the food and the water, the fibre, the fuel, the timber, the clean air, the decomposers that eat our waste, and so on. And we call these things ecosystem services. And they range from the very direct provisioning services, so things that we harvest directly from nature, right through to intangibles like spiritual awe of standing at the bottom of a huge Wellingtonia tree and looking up. And I'm sure that through lockdown, a lot more of you have experienced some of that what we call biophilia, that feeling closer to nature and seeing more of nature during lockdown when we all slowed down a little bit. So all of these things are clearly important, not just in their own right, but in how they support human society as well. So that's biodiversity. What's the gain part about? Well, this report was produced last year by the UN. It's an intergovernmental science policy platform, and they did a detailed study across the state of biodiversity globally. And it shows us quite clearly that current approaches are not enough. 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and we need to do something massively different. If we keep going the way we are, we're heading into a massive extinction, which is obviously not only bad in its own right, but it affects our ability to tackle climate change and actually affects all of those goods and services we saw on the previous slide. Now, biodiversity was having a bit of a moment this year. We had the IUCN conference, there was to be a World Oceans Conference, and the conferences of the parties on the international conventions on climate change and biodiversity were both due to happen this year. They've now all been transferred across to next year, hopefully, but we're still working even now on what the frameworks are going to look like, what the agreement's going to look like at those conferences, and how are things going to be moving forward. Now, the key recommendations are going to be around much greater areas of land and sea protected for the benefit of biodiversity, 30% of land and sea under some sort of conservation management, and 10% under strict protection. We're talking about mainstreaming biodiversity assessment across all land uses, so not just development land uses, but making sure that we compare and see what the different impacts of different policies, different land use policies are. You'll have noticed a review coming out around planning and environmental impact assessment that's coming forward. Now, if we look across pollinators, for example, look at pollinators, many of those are at risk. And if we lose pollinators, then we could lose 35% of global crops. So we need to shore up our natural ecosystems. This isn't a nice to have or something that only ecologists need to be concerned about. This is climate change with bells on. So organisations need to be prepared for that and to report on the biodiversity impacts and the associated climate change impacts of all of their operations and not just their projects. And biodiversity net gain is one route to that. So there's the definition of biodiversity net gain. It's just quite simply an approach to development that leaves biodiversity in a better state afterwards than it was before. Now, has been around since about 2012 in the UK as a concept and has been applied by some developers and some local authorities. It's been in the National Planning Policy Framework, but it will finally be mandated in law when the Environment Bill comes into effect, probably early next year now. And there'll be a sort of a 2-year period as that's introduced. Now, technically, the Environment Bill will exempt major infrastructure at the moment. It will apply to things carried out under the Town and Country Planning Act but a lot of major infrastructure developers are implementing it voluntarily. A lot of companies are implementing it voluntarily. So Balfour Beatty is implementing it. Berkeley Homes already does biodiversity net gain, Network Rail, HS2 all have their own systems for doing this. So how do we go about doing it? First of all, if you want to know whether you're going to be able to deliver a biodiversity net gain, then obviously you need to know what you started out with before development. And to do this, we do a good old traditional phase 1 survey. This is the basic walkover survey that ecologists always do for a pipeline project, and you'll recognise the colouring in pencils here. Now, we've started recently to use a new technique called the UK Habitat Survey, which is very similar. It works in a very similar way. It's mapping habitats and areas of different habitats along a scheme, but it's much more compatible with the biodiversity net gain calculator, so it's much easier to feed straight into a biodiversity net gain calculation. So most things are moving over to that, and as you go ahead with schemes in the future, you might want to actually ask the UK HAB if you're thinking that you'll be doing any sort of calculation of biodiversity losses and gains. So we work out what all the habitats are, we work out the area that we have on our scheme of each habitat type, and then we multiply that by a number of modifiers that help us to say how important that is. So we modify for distinctiveness, that's kind of how valuable it is. Is it a rare habitat type? Is it a particularly important habitat type? So a rare calcareous grassland type would score more highly than an amenity grassland, for example. We look at what condition it's in. Is it already in good condition? Is it a representative of that habitat type? And then we look at a couple of other things around its strategic location. Where is it located? Is it connected into other habitats, or is it a little isolated island? How well connected is it? And we do these, we multiply those up, and we, for each habitat type, and we get a total number of biodiversity units at the beginning of the development. We then look at the predicted outcomes post-development. So we do the same sort of calculation again, but with a couple of other variations. And so we look at the distinctiveness and the condition again, the strategic location and connectivity. And then we look at, well, this is not just the habitats that will be retained, but also the habitats that are going to be restored after your development. And so we look at what those habitats are in a bit more detail, and we say, how difficult are those habitats to actually create? How long will it take for them to get to the target condition? And then we have a little multiplier for the off-site risk. So those modifiers can bring your score down post-development. And then this is the only maths bit in the presentation. And then we simply subtract the one from the other. So we take the number of units that will be left after the works, take away what you had at the beginning, and then we have a number. And that could be 0. It could be you've got exactly the same as you had before. You've restored everything and made it a little more valuable in places, so you've managed to cover any losses and you've achieved net 0. You might have, again, if you've done particularly distinctive habitat creation, or you might have a loss, and that's what most projects will deliver at the first pass, at least. But it's an iterative process. We're doing this as early as we can in the design stage, and so we go back and we revisit the design again. So is there any more habitat that we could retain on this scheme? For example, could we look particularly at habitats that are worth a lot of biodiversity units, the more diverse habitats? Can we save any more of those? Can we do any more on-site to increase biodiversity value? So what are the habitats that we're creating on-site? Well, could we do something that's slightly more diverse? Could we do a lowland meadow rather than just putting back recreational amenity grassland, for example? When we've done everything we can on-site, well, can we work with a local farmer to create some new habitat adjacent to our scheme, do something off-site? And only when all of those options have been used up do we get to a compensation stage where we say, well, can we pay for an offset somewhere else? So the aim is really that we need to deliver any shortfall in units that our site had, plus our 10% net gain. So 10% of your baseline units as a gain. So a couple of places where we've applied this methodology recently. This is East-West Rail. I'm sorry, it's not a pipeline, but it is a linear scheme, and it has some sort of relevance to this. So East-West Rail is a strategic connection between Oxford and Cambridge. Network Rail is already committed to delivering net gain, and the East-West Rail Alliance committed to delivering a measurable net gain in biodiversity and contributing to the nature conservation of the region. So despite the fact that this is opening a railway on an existing railway line effectively, a lot of that railway line had been mothballed since the Beeching Review. And so rather than a railway, it was really more like a linear nature reserve in places. So in order to widen it out and create access, quite a large amount of vegetation was going to be removed, and that was leading to a significant net loss of biodiversity along the scheme as a whole. Now, obviously, that wasn't a situation that Network Rail wanted to have, so they looked into that in more detail, and we went through this iterative process of trying to value engineering out some of those losses. So the whole of the drainage scheme, for example, was looked at again and found that we could do the drainage in a slightly different way, and we could manage to retain a lot more vegetation along the edges of the scheme than we thought we could originally. Some areas where we'd taken access on both sides because it was easier, well, actually, we probably only needed access on one side. And so we brought down significantly the amount of vegetation that was lost, and that had benefits not just from biodiversity net gain calculations, but also for bats and other species that foraged up and down the side of the railway. We then created compensation sites alongside the route that were within the red line for the scheme, so we had control over and could actually deliver the habitats in perpetuity that we needed to recreate, to offset. And then eventually, once we got our loss down as low as we could within our own scheme, then the Alliance are now working in partnership with stakeholders up and down the scheme, so local landowners, local wildlife trusts and so forth, to deliver their outstanding units. Another scheme here is Snowdonia Visual Impact Project. Now that was a high profile set of projects really, from National Grid to underground overhead power lines throughout national parks in England and Wales. And that's really not, again, not driven by legislation, that's driven by National Grid's own intention to do that. So they wanted to deliver despite the fact that this scheme is landscape driven, they wanted to deliver a measurable biodiversity net gain. Now, obviously, in doing so, to underground a cable, obviously you take a much wider swathe, you have a much greater impact on the vegetation and the habitats that are present than you do by having an overhead line. So it is one of those difficult situations where you're doing something for the best of intentions to deliver a visual benefit, you're actually potentially having a bigger biodiversity loss. So our team worked with National Grid through that iterative process again to make sure that we could cite not just the cable run, but all the associated laydown areas and working areas to make sure that we avoid the most valuable habitats. In this case, they were sort of mossland habitats. So by avoiding that again, by thinking this through, using this method to think about your biodiversity impacts, it's also causing us to look again at our design and think about things that might have been overlooked, such as the fact that, well, actually from a carbon point of view, peatland habitats are the ones we want to leave alone actually and not dig off. And perhaps we want to be revising our design a little bit for that reason. So again, that scheme's been through iterations of design and is now on track to deliver a 10% net gain. But converting nature, I've talked about the complexity of nature, into a number, a single number, is problematic. It's like comparing apples with an early Pink Floyd album. And so we can't forget that it is more than this number. For a start, our biodiversity metric as we use it at the moment simply talks about habitats. It doesn't deal with species, and it is quite insensitive in some ways. There are things that work better and not quite so well with it. It's still being developed. The version that we're using at the moment is a beta test version, and probably middle of next year, I would think we might have settled on a final version. And you do need to remember that there are some things that simply can't be replaced. This is an ancient woodland, and you'll have all heard lots of stories around protesters in the ancient woodland on HS2 this year. And ancient woodland and other what we call irreplaceable habitats like limestone pavement aren't included within the metrics. We don't include them in our net gain calculations because you can't simply balance it off against how much to replace. And so in each project, it has to be taken in a case-by-case basis. And if you're affecting ancient woodland, then you will have to come up with a bespoke compensation package. And as an example, on HS2, I think at the moment, they're using a ratio of about 1 to 10. So you're replacing 10 times as much as you lose. So when you've got a linear scheme with a little bit of wiggle in it, the best approach is, of course, to avoid those sorts of habitats wherever you can, because it's really going to become more and more difficult to deal with. Now, I've spoken briefly about the DEFRA metric. So this is the official government metric used for offsetting, but there are a range of other things around. If you're working on a Network Rail project, you would obviously use Network Rail's calculator at the moment, though I think they are going to merge with the DEFRA metric soon. HS2 has its own, Coventry County Council actually has its own. They'll all give you slightly different results, and far be it from me to suggest that you play tunes on it, but I think we will be coming together very soon into an official national DEFRA metric, and that's probably the one to start getting familiar with and to start asking your consultants to use on your schemes, so you can see, even if you haven't got a commitment to doing net gain yet, it's coming, and you probably want to see how far adrift you are in projects as you go along. So a few things to consider then. Well, first of all, avoid losing lots of biodiversity units in the first place is key to this. Taking that iterative approach to design, following the mitigation hierarchy, and just getting your ecological information at the earliest point in your project, and so understanding what are things to avoid if you possibly can, and do that, because it's going to be way easier and cheaper than doing anything else down the line. So when you do get a shortfall then, how to get the most bang for your buck creating biodiversity units? Well, obviously, that's got to depend a little bit on where you are and what are the surrounding habitats. You can't suddenly start planting trees at the top of a Scottish mountain, but we can have a little look at what's appropriate in your site, what's nearby, and then look at, well, what are the things where we can get to target condition the quickest? What are the things where we can get you to the highest value? What are the most diverse and distinctive habitats that we could create on this soil type? So, get your ecologists to use a little bit of thought and try to deliver you as much as you possibly can on site. Where can we get some area in and some linear habitats in, and sort of effectively ramp up our scores that way. So look at what you can do to achieve the most on your site. We need to look at social issues because biodiversity, as I've said from the start, is hugely important to people in lots of different ways. And, part of those goods and services that the environment provides is just around the fact that people like to look out and see green. So social issues, who are the human winners and losers? Have you taken all the losses in one end of your pipeline and actually delivered all your compensation at the other? Because that's not really equitable. So, we need to perhaps look a little across, evening those losses and gains out and making sure that there's no communities that are that are losing more than winning. And then looking at the balance between what you're going to deliver on site versus what you're going to deliver off site. Because, off site, the further away from your site you go, you'll get less and less credit for. So the metrics are forcing you to try and do things on site as close as you can. But once you've exhausted the possibilities for doing things on site, if you go off site, then rather than do a little isolated island of habitat creation somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you've got scope to join in with bigger strategic schemes. So strategic rewilding schemes, nature improvement areas, or pondscapes across the county being delivered by a great crested newt local licensing scheme, for example. So do have a look at where you can get extra synergies and get more credit for what you deliver. And then just finally, a little spoiler for the future is that just when you've all got your heads around biodiversity net gain, it is actually government policy to move on to something we call environmental net gain, which builds on the biodiversity net gain and looks at all of the different services provided by the environment. So that this will look at water and carbon and so on as well. So we'll be moving into much wider thinking about this. And I think it's fair to say that as you develop schemes over the next 10 years, you'll see a significant change in how we're delivering it and how we're looking at natural capital and the services the environment provides. And I'm going to hand over to John to tell us a little bit about how to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steph. I'm going to hurtle through this quite quickly so we can get some, hopefully get some questions in at the end. So basically, how might you be able to achieve biodiversity net gain on your projects? So Steph talks you through some of that, but we're here to help. So we are RSK Wilding. We've just established pretty recently, and our idea is to create these sites for our clients and to achieve as many different things on them as we possibly can. So they'll be focused on biodiversity net gain, but we'll try and achieve a lot of other things as well. And rewilding is a term that I'm sure some of you will have heard. It is basically all things to all people. At one extreme, it really is just leaving nature to itself and hardly doing anything with it. And at the other end, it's quite high intervention, sort of reintroduction of wolves. And that's the part of rewilding that I think a lot of people have heard of, because the people who are doing that tend to kind of shout a bit louder about it. But we're going to be rather closer to the other extreme. It's going to be more of a bottom-up, sort of low intervention approach where we're focusing on the biodiversity side of things. So a lot of it will be biodiversity net gain led, but we will be very keen to sequester carbon, improve water quality, reduce flooding, all those other good things that can be done when you manage the landscape in the right way. So what's the idea behind our enterprise? Well, on the one hand, we've got the demand. So that'll be people such as yourselves, other developers who have this knotty issue of having to deal with biodiversity net gain. How are you going to achieve it? So we have those people who want something done. We have other companies who are perhaps offsetting carbon impacts, where we can help them to, if we're doing stuff that will sequester carbon. Other companies also that might want to do other good natural capital improvements to improve their CSR, for instance. And then there are philanthropists as well who are rather more altruistically just wanting to make a difference and to do the right thing, basically. So that's the demand side. And on the supply side, we've got farmers who in the near future will no longer have European subsidies, so they will be looking for income streams. So we will be paying, we'll be sort of acting as a broker to pay those landowners to do good wildlife management. It might end up being a top up to the new government scheme that will be coming out called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So it might be we have sort of private-public partnerships almost, where some of it is government funded and some of it is funded from people such as ourselves through you. And then there will be other landowners, including clients who have land and they just want to, again, do the right thing perhaps, or it could be that it's clients such as National Grid, or EWR who may have non-operational land that we could use to enhance wildlife, and then they can get some revenue from their land. So really what RSK Wilding is doing is brokering between the two. We're bringing the demand and the supply together. Now, you'll often see on tenders that people say they are unrivaled at this and that, but I do think in this case we have in RSK a very wide range of different companies under the RSK umbrella who do lots of different things that kind of fit the bill here. Ooh, that's fairly disastrous. What's happened there? Don't panic. Right, sorry about that. Let's try again. Phew. Right, so Steph and I work for RSK Biocensus, so we're the ecology side, so we do the metrics, the net gain calculations, footprinting, and we do, importantly, the monitoring of the sites thereafter. So for the 20, 30 years that the project is ongoing, we're there to make sure it's doing what we want it to. We have ADAS as well, who are experts in agri-environment schemes, landowner liaisons, so they're very much on the supply side, but they've also got experts in natural capital metrics and ecosystem services, carbon offsetting, etc. So they can do all of that side of the equation. We have 3 companies that do the hands-on, on the ground stuff, the fencing, the habitat creation, vegetation management if it's required throughout the time that we'll be managing the land. And then we have carbon, climate and sustainability teams who have carbon accounting and offsetting expertise as well. And then if for instance, Steph talked about the social side of things, if we are doing rewilding for a client close to an urban setting, then we might want to build an educational centre, for instance, or an outdoor centre or whatever. And we've got companies that can do very sustainable heating and green architecture to make the buildings green as well. So we've got a pretty wide range of skills across the team. And what's really driving all of this is the fact that there's so much traction about rewilding. So we think it's a really good time to do this. Natural capital is having a moment as well. You might not agree with Extinction Rebellion's methods, but they are raising people's awareness of biodiversity loss and also the whole climate crisis as well. So it's a very good time to do this. So how would it work in practice? Well, there are sort of 4 guiding principles, really, 4 main things we need to consider. Where are we going to do it? How are we going to sort the funding? How is that going to work? How much habitat creation will we need? How interventionist is it? Is it going to be very low intervention, or are we going to do quite a lot? And how do we know that our offsetting has worked? So the monitoring side. So the first one of those is site selection. As Steph said, proximity to the development, to the source of the impact is very important. Otherwise, the biodiversity credits start losing value. So you do want to have your rewilding site quite close to the development site if you can. We very much want to focus on marginal land that is hard for farmers to make a living on. So we're giving them almost an easier revenue stream, which is also doing good stuff for wildlife. We don't want to be taking good agricultural land out of productivity. That would be a silly thing to do, so we don't want to do that. And we also want to tie into the Natural England habitat networks. So these areas have been identified as potentially good links between existing protected sites. So that map on the left shows you some designated sites, Ramsar sites in blue, I think. The green is SACs. And the brown is sort of the linking habitats. If you look a bit closer, you can see the darker brown there is what they call the fragmentation action zone. So if we were to rewild in one of those areas, then we're acting as a stepping stone between existing good sites. So this will enhance the value of what we're doing if we can actually fit within these networks and do our work within properly restorable habitat and in a fragmentation zone, for instance. But we'd also want to identify areas that are particularly good for offsetting carbon, because we want to get those benefits as well. So there will be different parts of the country that are better for that and others that are not so good. And then we'll also want to do the same for all sorts of other natural capital benefits. So whilst biodiversity net gain might be the driver commercially, because that's where the money might come from mainly, we're obviously looking to get as many other bells and whistles on this as we possibly can. But of course, ultimately, the most important thing is the availability of land. Have we got it available to us? So that's rather important in site selection. Can't just go blundering into someone else's land. Right, Steph said that she had all the mathematics, but you can't beat this for a bit of maths. So if you go from there to there, you get that. There we are. So that's what rewilding is all about. We're converting land that is not very good for wildlife into really nice wildlife land and getting paid for it. So Steph talked about biodiversity units lost and gained, so I won't go over that. But one biodiversity unit, just to give you an idea, is roughly £10,000 to £20,000, something like that. It's a market, this, so it could be more than that, could be less than that. But that's what you're thinking. If you've got a site that is, I don't know, 50 biodiversity units that you've got to gain, then that's, you know, £500,000. So we're not talking small amounts of money. But what do you get for your money? Well, we would obviously have to start off by producing a strategy for the whole period. As I say, I've said 30 years. We'd want to do this for as long as we can, but we'd need to basically establish from the start how many biodiversity units are on site, what we intend to do with that site, and what that would lead to in 20 or 30 years' time. So how many biodiversity units and credits, carbon credits and whatever you achieve. We'd have to include in that any plans for active sort of site establishment. And buying the land is obviously could be an issue. If you've got the land yourself, that makes things a lot cheaper. We'd need to talk about the long-term management of the site, whether it's low intervention or high intervention, and then we'll talk about monitoring as well. So that's got to be part of the whole thing. And I can't see that because my screen has gone a bit weird. So I can't remember what the last point was. I'll move on. Right, site restoration. So this is the second thing, is to what extent are we going to intervene? Is it low intervention, no intervention? We have people who can create ponds and wetland areas, topsoil strip, and sow wildflower mix. So really it depends right from the start, from our experts on carbon and natural capital and biodiversity, what we want to do. So we come up with our plan at the start, and that will obviously inform what we do on site as far as site establishment is concerned. It might be we just leave it completely. And of course, those ongoing costs are going to need to be included in the funding model, because that's potentially a fairly expensive part of it. And finally, the monitoring. So we have the expertise to identify the biodiversity on site first, and then to calculate the units and work out what is going to be created on site. And then we will create a monitoring strategy to tell you how that land is progressing. You're not going to want to give us some money and then just walk away and say, we trust you. You'll probably want to have a good idea of that it's working in the way that you want it to. And we don't want to throw tons of money at that. We want that to be as cost effective as possible. We don't want to have 300 people going out on site doing surveys. We want to keep it nice and cost effective. So we have a variety of different ways of doing that will keep it simple. I mean, the habitat mapping is obviously the main part of it, but there are other measures we'll have as well. And ultimately, we just want it to be a very robust process, so that our clients have the assurity that we are doing what we've said we're going to do, and we're giving them the results they want. That was a very quick skip through, and it probably only gives us a couple of minutes, I'm afraid. So I shall hand back if I can.
Okay, have you?
Ooh, there we go.
Yeah, right, that's great. Okay, thanks, Steph. Thanks, John. Really interesting presentations, and some of the things I've learned quite a bit there. And I'm, let's say, more of an engineer than an environment. So it was really quite interesting. We've got 2 or 3 questions, so I think we've just got time to sort of take those in. The first one, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. I think it's N. Kersey, and it says, does biodiversity value allow for easy wins by the developers? E.g., can a single species of flora or fauna be introduced to the area and thereby meet the 10% gain requirement?
No, it's the short answer to that one, because diversity is exactly that. It's about diversity, and it's not about a single species. So, no, if you have a job lot of poplar trees left over from some landscaping project on a previous job, and just scatter them up and down the line, that wouldn't really cut it. So we're looking at what's there and what's appropriate for that location. Okay,
thanks for that, Steph. As the next question comes from Chloe Delgery, and she said, can you tell us how these compensation sites were secured by East West Rail? I assume due to the nature of the scheme, land available for net gain, and in brackets in the red line, is very restricted. So I wondered how EWR found them. and secured these compensation areas?
Yeah, no, you're right. It is quite difficult because at the moment the law will allow you to take land by compulsory purchase for essential environmental mitigation. There is nothing specific in the law at the moment that will let you take it for net gain. So that's a little a little more tricky. So Network Rail through the East West Rail Alliance did manage to include some areas, some compensation sites within the Red Line, and that was where they were also using those compensation sites for things like great crested newt ponds that they needed to create to get their European protected species licenses and so on. And then they did a lot by that. They did a lot by landowner agreement, so talking to nearby landowners and actually securing the land by going into a direct contract with them. And I think they worked on a 99-year lease as their standard model. But yeah, sometimes there will be an issue where you just can't, you can't acquire everything you need at the moment through CPO, and you might need to look at other ways or contributing to a strategic offsetting plan.
The next question comes from Tom Bealey. What weight do you see being given to local nature recovery strategies within planning? Will they be regarded as a new form of land designation?
That's a really good question. I would hope so, is my view. I mean, you've seen the planning reform documents that came out last week, was it? And this idea that we'll kind of divide the country up into three bits, the build bit, the build after a little while bit, and you'll have to go through the normal process to build bit. So it depends how firmly the government applies the protect zone within that new planning framework and what designations they decide to put into it. But I think given the commitments they've said in the 25-year environment plan, and given the commitments that they've been making regarding the post-2020 frameworks for biodiversity, then I think that has got to be stronger. And I think that would be one way. Frankly, it would make things a lot easier for all of us if we knew what a designation meant. If it meant, no, don't go in here, go around it. Or if it meant, well, yes, you can, as long as you mitigate and compensate for it. Whereas at the moment, we all spend a lot of time in public inquiries arguing about which it is.
Mm-hmm. And the next is sort of a little bit of a follow-on from that, and asking, are government totally aligned to your thinking?
Are they totally aligned to my thinking? Very rarely, I would say, the current government is totally aligned.
Can I answer that on rewilding, maybe?
Yeah.
Because at the moment, government, what they're proposing isn't designed for rewilding, so we're kind of jumping on the bandwagon a little bit. So we want rewilding to fit well with the DEFRA and biodiversity net gain, and it isn't designed for that. So at the moment, I don't think it is, but there's no reason why we shouldn't talk to Natural England and others about using these areas to offset people's impacts. You know, there isn't, you know, a specific rewilding habitat category, for instance, in the metric. Yeah. So we would like that, and we'd also like not to be penalised, which we are currently by the metric, from doing rewilding quite a long way from the impact site. If what you're doing is contributing to a really massive, spatially exciting, landscape-based rewilding project some way away, but you get penalised because you're quite a long way from the development, then that's really not what Natural England should be doing. You know, we don't want Natural England penalising us for that. So I think there is work to be done, but at the moment, you know, we haven't had those discussions.
In terms of the broad concept of, is the government aligned with the thinking that we really need to do a lot more to deliver a net gain so that we stop seeing massive extinctions, then yes, that is government policy.
The next question's from William Atteridge, and he's said, very interesting to hear that other RSK divisions are involved. Are you using drones with your processes? RSK Orbital has the potential.
Well, everything's up for grabs, really. I mean, anything that allows us to monitor cost effectively, we would want to do. So drones is very much could be a part of that. Absolutely. We've got other methodologies where you could put microphones into a field, and it records sound, and it kind of converts that into a biodiversity measure. So that if you put it in a field of just improved grassland, it would be very quiet. But if you put it into a meadow, it would be really noisy. And you can actually use that to gauge how much biodiversity is increasing over time. So there'll be various things we'll be using. But yes, I think that would definitely be something we'd like to use.
Yeah. I think we've just a couple more questions. Was that? Sorry, I might be. Yeah, there's 3 more questions from. I've got one from PX Thomas. I don't know who that is. Is local provenance given priority in the calculation?
Not in the calculations per se. There's a lot that isn't really in the calculations. The calculations themselves are, have to be relatively straightforward in order to give us an easy measure that we can apply from one site to another and compare them. But local provenance is still really important. And there are things like that and things like dealing with protected species that are outside of the biodiversity net gain process that you really need to talk to your ecologist about.
Okay, so we've now got a question from Lexi Yates, and there's how much would it cost to have some land reviewed for its baseline value and potential rewilding opportunities? That might be as long as a piece of string.
Yeah.
There you go, John.
Crumbs. I mean, the initial habitat mapping isn't that much, actually. I think, I wouldn't expect people to commit to rewilding until, we've had a look at the site and given a bit of a feasibility study of it. So I don't know, a few thousand, just to do the mapping and come up with a broad plan and basically to say, yes, you've got scope to rewild here, or I don't think it's worth doing. But so yes, it wouldn't cost too much, I think.
Yeah. So we've sort of two more questions, and then we'll close off. This one's from James Peacock. Really interesting. Do you see biodiversity net gain becoming mandated for infrastructure schemes? Also, how do farmers contact you about land that they have available for offsetting?
All right, Steph can do the first bit. I'll do the second bit.
Okay, perfect. I've forgotten the first bit now.
Do you see biodiversity net gain becoming mandated?
Oh, do I see it becoming mandated? Yes, I do, is the short answer to that bit. Some of the consultation responses on the current metric have talked about that, and when DEFRA went out to consultation and when the Environment Bill has been consulted on, the fact that it didn't include infrastructure projects was raised as one of the issues. There is a consultation going on, there's a bit of work going on at the moment around DCOs and biodiversity net gain. So I think it is on the cards, and we'll let it get embedded in Town and Country Planning Act first and then roll it out further. But I think, as I said, I think a lot of the big infrastructure developers are just thinking ahead of that anyway. John.
Yeah, as for the second bit, how do farmers contact you? I like this. He says, I have a friend who thinks he might have some land. It's a bit like that 9 o'clock news sketch. Yes, well, we have a website that will be coming up and running. So we're launching within a week or two. So look out for that. And there'll be a website with contact details. And yes, we will, people can just contact that wilding at rsk.co.uk. And we can get in touch with them. So that's probably the easiest answer.
And then we've a final question from Jessica Postons, and this is, thanks for the presentation. Is there a risk with the potential land costs to achieve BNG that some projects could become unaffordable without the ability to CPO land for this purpose and only for essential mitigation?
I think that's I don't know what you think, Steph. I think land prices could become a real issue. Sorry, go on. Yeah. Sorry, Steph, go on.
I was going to say that's always a risk, but the aim with every project has got to be to try and follow the mitigation hierarchy and avoid and reduce the impacts first of all, mitigate on site where you can, and just get that land down to that need for land off-site as low as you can before you get to that point. That said, there's a lot of farmers now who are going to see lower subsidies post when we leave the EU in December, who will be looking for other ways to make money to replace that level of income, and therefore, you know, may well be more amenable than they would in the past to talking to developers about, well, do they really need that field corner over there? Would they be happy to have a pond?
Yeah, and so you wouldn't need to buy it. I mean, when we were first thinking, it's a very good question actually, Jessica, because we were thinking of buying land at the start of this when we first set it up, and then COVID happened and it all became a bit harder to spend tons of cash. So we kind of pivoted a bit and decided that talking to farmers and giving them extra subsidies was the way to do it. That kind of cuts over that idea, that problem, because you don't have to buy the land. And you can have an agreement for 30 years and the purchase of the land isn't part of that. So that's, as I said, there'll be many different ways of doing this. It'll be a bespoke situation each time, but working with farmers should make it cheaper, definitely. And it's going to be,
well,
sorry,
carry on.
No, I'm done.
I was just going to close off, so yeah.
I do hate Zoom sometimes. I'll leave you to close, don't worry. I'm sure I was not going to say anything interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to thank both Steph and John for a really thought-provoking presentation, and certainly something that we'll all becoming involved in the near future. I'm sure. I'm particularly interested in the changes to the planning system, and that's going to have a huge impact in this. And I wonder about the resources to actually manage it, but that's maybe for another day.
Yeah.
So thanks again. I'd like to remind everybody that we are running an extensive webinar program. We've got 3 more presentations on the Guild Goes Green program. But on Thursday, we have our next one, which is Effective Working Relations from Emma Davies of EMD Inspire. And then next Tuesday, we're looking at Digging Up Britain 2020 and what can we learn from the millions of works taking place across the UK, and that's Richard Broom of LS Bud. So please, if you're interested in those, then you can book on. All the details are on our website, and Kate sends out emails so that you're able to do that. Just as a final reminder, today's webinar will be on the Guild YouTube channel. So please go to that if you'd like to reprise this presentation. And I'd like to thank you all finally for taking part in the webinar. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I look forward to, I know I'm speaking to you now, but perhaps meeting with you in the very near future. So thanks again, Steph and John, and thanks to everybody for taking part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.